Okay, chapter 11. We're in 11.1. And with 11.1, it's a slight spin-off of what we were doing in chapter 10. The biggest difference in chapter 11 is that we're now doing quadratic equations. And with the first part of quadratic equations, we're going to look at different ways of solving. And the very first thing that's in 11.1 is we're going to solve using the square root property. So for this part of it, it's the exact same thing we had before, but instead of having square root of x equals to 100 or 10 or whatever the number is going to be, now we're starting with x squared. So it's the same thing we had before, but we're just doing it in reverse order. So if you have x squared equals 100, and they tell you to use a square root property, well, you're going to square root both sides. And when you square root both sides, you get the square root of x to be x squared to be x. When you square root 100, you get 10. This is the one time where, that for this part of it, because you're starting off with x squared, you're looking for two answers. So we're going to have positive 10, but we're also going to have negative. So this would be one where you're actually going to do plus or minus. Now, I think that's one thing that they didn't tell you that was here. But there's one little thing, and you don't have to necessarily know exactly what it is, but it's the fundamental theorem of algebra. They don't mention it here, but this is really what it's coming down to. And basically it says this: whatever equation you're working with, whatever your original equation starts with, whatever your highest power of x is, that's how many answers you're looking for. So if we start off with x squared, you got to give me two answers. So when you do this, that's where we're getting the plus or minus 10 for that part of it. And that's the one thing that you can kind of go through on some of these when we're doing these parts, especially when we're doing everything here with all the quadratics. You're always looking for two answers when you're going through all the parts of these. All right. And if you're going to use a square root property, which is what they're going to have you do in the first part of it, it's still going to be that same setup, kind of like when we're doing the square roots, that when you're going through the answers, you're still going to have some that's perfect square roots like we had square root of 100. You're going to have some more where you're going to have some imperfect square roots. So you have x squared equals 8. So square root both sides. And with the 80, that's the part that you'll have to break down. Again, you can break it down all kinds of different ways. You could do 2 times 40, you could do 10 times 8, all kinds of different numbers. But if you get one that you kind of think about, if you did 16 times 5, you've got square root of 16, which would be a perfect square root number. So for square root of 16, you can make that 4 square root of 5. So for this one, your x would equal positive or negative 4 square root of 5. And they'll kind of come back to you on the other part here. Kind of like a lot of other problems we had in the past. Let's say you had x squared equals negative 9. Now, the catch on this one is, now, still going through the same thing as we did before. that if you've got x squared equals 9, you would square root both sides. If we did the square root of x squared, that would get us x. Now, kind of going back, and here's where you have to be just a little bit careful. Coming out of the last section, if we did the square root of negative 9, that would be 3i because of the part that's in here. Now, the thing is for this one, they tell you we're not doing any imaginary solutions on this one. So if you get the square root of a negative number, where you're going to get imaginary solution, they're going to tell you, all right, don't tell me the imaginary solution. Just tell me in this case that there is no real solution. So when you're going through these, they'll give you that option so that if you square root a negative number, yes, we do get imaginary, but they're saying, all right, just leave these answers in terms of real number answers. So tell me that there's not a real solution as you're going through those. So no imaginary numbers right now. They're wanting to try to keep everything real when we're going through these. Okay, so let's do x squared minus 45 equals 0. Okay, if they give it to you where you've got x squared minus 45 in this case equals 0, kind of like we were doing before when we had the square roots, you want to get the square root by itself. This one, if they want you to do the square root property, you've got to get the squared number by itself. So first thing you would want to do is to add the 45 to both sides. All right, and once you've got the x squared by itself, you've got the number on the other side, then you can go ahead and square root both sides. Okay, 45 is not a perfect square root, so start breaking it down. And again, the first thing I'm thinking is it's 9 times 5. And that way you've got the perfect square root with a 9. So you make that 3 and then square root of 5. So for your x, it'd be plus or minus 3 squared of 5. Again, I'm not sure that they give you the plus or minus button. If they do, you can use it. If not, then you have to just separate it where you've got one answer is 3 squared of 5, comma, the other answer would be negative 3 squared of 5. Okay, so let's say you've got m plus 4 squared equals 40. And again, they're still going to tell you to use the square root property. So you've got the left-hand side squared, so it's okay like it is. You've got the 40 on the other side. So as long as you've got, now again, it's not just m, in this case it's m plus 4, but it's still this thing squared all by itself, so we can still square both sides, or square root both sides. All right, on the left-hand side, square and square root cancel each other out, so you get just the m plus 4. On the right-hand side, I think we did 40 earlier. If you took 40 and broke it down, it'd be 4 times 10. Square root of 4, you can make it 2. And now 10, you can break it, make it 2 times 5, but you don't have any pairs of anything. So 40 would just be 2 square root of 10. Again, still a plus or minus. Okay, for this one, because before we just had the m, we had the plus or minus 2 square root of 10, that was your answer. You've still got to get rid of this 4. So your next step is you've got to subtract it to both sides. So the m is by itself, and with the negative 4, just put it in front of the plus or minus. So if you could write it as one answer with the plus or minus in there, that would be the answer. If you actually split it up as 2 separate answers, it would be negative 4 plus 2 square root of 10 and negative 4 minus 2 square root of 10. Again, that's more than likely that's how you're going to have to write the answers, because I'm pretty sure there's not a plus or minus button when you're going through these. Yeah, the examples I'm looking at, I don't see anything where you've got that plus or minus. So the only thing that they'll do a little bit different towards the back end when doing some of these examples of the square root property is that, again, instead of just giving you x squared or y squared, they put an extra variable in here. But it just means at the end of it, you're just going to have to add or subtract that number away to the answer to get what you're looking for. All right, I'll show you one more like that, though. Sometimes you need a couple of them just to make sure. Okay, for this one, let's do w plus 8 squared minus 63 equals 0. So you've got the w plus 8 squared. Again, first thing is let's add the 63 to both sides. We have w plus 8 squared equals 63. So now you have this thing squared by itself. So now we can square root both sides. Again, the square and the square root cancel out here just to get w plus 8. For this one it's plus or minus, but when we break down 63, you can do 21 times 3. You could also do 9 times 7. If you do 9 times 7, again, there's a perfect square root with 9, so you can make that 3 with a square root of 7 left on the inside. And because you've got w plus 8, you've got to subtract 8 on both sides. So for this one, your w would be, again, two answers, is negative 8 plus 3 square root of 7. Then negative 8 minus 3 square root of 7. Okay. Now, and depending on the numbers, if that had been a perfect square root of 64 for this one, sometimes when you do the pluses or minuses through here, it may be that when you get to the end, you may have a perfect answer. That if that had been just for, let's just throw this out here. Let's say that had been square root of 64. Just so we can kind of see it real quick. When you square root both sides, you get w plus 8 equals, when you square root 64, you get 8 plus or minus. So for that answer, you would have w would equal, you'd subtract 8 from both sides. So one answer would be negative 8 plus 8, which would be 0. And your other answer would be negative 8 minus 8, which would be negative 16. So if the number they give to you in this setup is a perfect square root number, you're going to get whole number answers. You're not going to have the radicals mixed in with it there. So sometimes they'll give you some where you get just two regular whole numbers or integers for your answers. Most of the time you're probably going to get the radicals where you're going to have a little bit of both there. Okay, and then the last thing out of section 1. So first 2/3 of the question section there, it's all just square roots. Keep taking square roots, keep taking square roots, keep taking square roots. The second thing they're going to have you look at is completing the square. And they use the first part of section 1 to kind of walk you into the second part. The second part is you've got numbers here that's close to taking square roots on both sides, but it's not quite there, so you're going to have to rearrange it so that you can do this. And the very first thing that they're going to ask you to do is they're going to ask you to, before you complete the square, the first thing they're actually going to ask you to do is they're going to ask you to make a perfect square. And they'll give you an expression and have you fill in the blank here. So it'll be something like this. It may be that it's x squared plus 14x plus, and then they'll actually give you a box and tell you, all right, you're going to go back and figure out what that number is. Okay, and if you've done this in other books, sometimes this was where they would put a C value in here, and they would tell you to find C value. So some places, and some of the books, the book we use, I think even the book that we use for pre-calc, it's kind of got that same setup that they'll tell you to find the C value. Every book has a little bit of something different, but it's still the same thing. It's still completing the square. You're going to do two things, or three depending on how you stretch it out. But basically is this. You're always going to take the middle term that you have here, which they're going to call the B term. And you're going to take the B term. And divide it by 2. So for this problem, we would take 14 and divide it by 2 to get 7. Step 2, you just square the answer from step 1. So take this 7 you've got and square it. So that's 49. And that is the number that would go right there. Now again, for what we're going to do, they're not going to have that as a C value. They're just going to have that as an empty box. So that would be the number that you're looking for. Now, here's the whole reason why they do this, and here's why they're kind of getting this thing set up. That if you had this 49 inside the box right here, you would have x squared plus 14x plus 49. Now, if you were to factor this thing, what are the factors of 49 that equal 14? 7 and 7, right? So you'd have x plus 7, and you have x plus 7. Oh, and if you've got two of the same thing, what can we rewrite it as? There you go, x plus 7 squared, right? And now that you've got it as a squared term, then you could go back and do the square root property and go back and use the square root property on both sides to solve it and get the answer. So that's kind of what they're doing for these. It's a setup question. They're saying, all right, if we could set this thing up in a perfect world where we had a perfect square root number so that we could rewrite it as x plus or minus something squared, what would the number have to be? Well, to find that number, you always take the B term, whatever's in the middle, divide it by 2, and then square that answer. You've got the number you're looking for. Okay, so that's kind of the setup question that they're going to do to kind of get you through this part. They'll give you 2 or 3. To the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen any that were fractions. Oh wait, there was one fraction. Whole numbers here. Let's do a couple more real quick because they don't take very long, just to be on the safe side. Okay, they can make it negative. You can have x squared minus 8x plus, and then again, fill in the blank here. But it's still going to be the same setup. You're going to take negative 8 and divide it by 2, which is negative 4. Then you're going to take the negative 4 and square it. So that would be 16. So that would be the number that you're looking for to fill that thing in. Now again, it doesn't matter that this was negative, because when you square the negative number, it's going to make it positive. So this thing would always be a positive in here. The kind of thing that they want you to, sometimes to me, the thing they want you to see, but sometimes we forget about, that if you had to write this as a perfect square root number, it's always going to be this first number you had here. So this would have been x minus 4 squared if we'd put the 16 back in here. So whatever you get here, which is the next thing we're going to do, once you've got this number, just know that you'll put that number in here to kind of factor it. All right, and if you do get a fraction, worst case scenario, because there's a possibility that you may get one of these. Take that back out for now because we don't need that part. Let's say you have t squared plus 13t plus, and then you got the box here. Okay, you've got 13 divided by 2, which doesn't simplify, right? Don't make it a fraction. I mean, don't make it into a decimal number. Leave it in fraction form. Take that 13 over 2 and go ahead and square it. 13 times 13 is 169. 2 times 2 is 4. And for one like that, that's all you can do. So if they ask you to fill in that blank, that would be the number that you're looking for right there. So if you have a fraction for the B term, that means you're going to have a fraction for the quote-unquote what that would be the C term. All right, now here's where they're going to tie all this together to get you to do a problem. So if you can get this, you're in great shape. If not, it's not that big a deal. It's maybe one question on the test. But they're going to ask you to solve by completing the square. So we're going to do the steps we did here to find out what this term would be, but it's just a little different look to kind of get us there. Okay, so it may look something like this. Okay, so very first thing is if you look at this one, because most people go, oh, I could factor that. Well, here's the thing. When you do completing the square, it's not anything that you could factor, because there are no factors of 4 that you can get 6. Doesn't happen. Or if it is, then you've come up with an extra number. Floppo. You know, whatever that may be. So for this one, you cannot factor it. It might look like it can, but there's no way you can factor these. So what you have to do is, when you're going through this part, if this is, for quadratics, they always put it in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c. That's kind of your basic quadratic equation. And all the numbers that we're looking for in chapter 11, it's all quadratics. So the a value is always in front of x squared, the b value is always with the x, and the c value, that's the constant that's the end that doesn't have an x. So for these, what you want to do is, you want to get rid of, you're going to get the c term by itself. So that when you get the left-hand side for this one, you want it so that it looks like this question up here, that you're going to have x squared plus 13x plus, and then you just got an empty space there. And that's what they want you to do. They want you to set this up in the same way. So the very first thing you would do for this one is, so first thing you're going to do is you're going to get the c term over by itself. So we're going to add that 4 to both sides. So you have x squared minus 6x. And leave a little gap in here. Equals 4. So now here's where we're going to do the exact same thing we did before. Step 2 is you're going to find this missing value. So find that value that they call, what do we call it a second ago? Look at the wording they had back here. Find the value to make it a perfect square. Okay, and that part's going to be the exact same thing we did before. You're going to take this negative 6 and divide it by 2, which is negative 3. And then you're going to take the negative 3 and square it to make it 9. Okay, and I've ran out of room, so I'm going to just get everybody get copied up on that part, and I'll jump down to the next page. You want to add that perfect square value. You're going to add it to the left-hand side. But if it's an equation, if you add it to the left side, add it to the right side also, don't you? Because it's an equation, you got to make it balance out. So for this one, you got to add that perfect square value to, here's the key thing, both sides. Because it's an equation, if you add 9 to one side, you have to add 9 to the other side. Now, what that does to the left-hand side is that's left-hand side is good for now. On the right-hand side, you've got 4 plus 9, so make that 13. Okay, the left-hand side, that's where you're going to factor this thing. And again, when you factor this one, you're going to factor it using that value, because the factors of 9 that equal negative 6, it's going to be negative 3 and negative 3. So this thing is going to factor as x minus 3 squared. All right, everybody okay with what we did there? That if you add the 9 to both sides, you go and do 4 plus 9 on the right-hand side to make it 13. The left-hand side is still just this expression. But what we're thinking is, and again, we're still kind of going back to the last part, the factors of 9 that equal negative 6, it's always going to be this b over 2 term. So it's going to be x minus 3 squared. Now you can actually square root both sides. So you have x minus 3 squared. When we square root it, that's just x minus 3. When you square it 13, 13 is not a perfect square number. It won't even break down. So that answer is just going to be plus or minus 13. And then the last thing we have to do, just like we did in the first part of that section, add the 3 on both sides. So your two answers would be that x would equal 3 plus the square root of 13, and then 3 minus the square root of 13. Now, and the way the homework is going to set up for these, they actually kind of give you a fill-in-the-blank part of it, that when you get to the first part, they're going to ask you to do two things. Number one, they're going to ask you to write it in factored form. So in the homework, this is going to be your part A answer. So they give you two options. They either give you one that's an x minus some number squared, or they give you one that's x plus number squared. So you'll just have to pick, the one for this one, you have to pick the one that's got a minus, and they'll give it to you basically like this. And they'll give you some blanks. They'll give you x minus 3 they'll put a blank here, and they'll put a blank here. And that's a plus. So all you have to do is whatever you had here from the B term, just make sure you use that sign. So this one you go back and put the 3 in here, and you put the 13 over here, so that you never have to put a plus or minus sign. They kind of give it set up where you either use a minus sign or you already use the plus sign. So that's the part A answer. You'd fill in the blank, and then for the part B answer, well, let's actually put the solution. Okay, you want one more of those? One more? Okay, one more and then we're done. Okay, so last problem of the night. Let's go with x squared minus 18x plus 75 equals 0. Okay, so, and again, it will tell you, do completing the squares. So the very first thing you're going to do is get rid of that 75. You get it to here. So you've got to find the perfect square value. Again, we're going to take the negative 18, divided by 2 to get negative 9. Now, the good part on this one is they should give you whole numbers, because when we're doing the whole thing with completing the square and actually finding answers, they shouldn't give you any with fractions, because it just makes it that much more complicated. So for now, they should all be whole numbers. Take the negative 9 and square it. That is 81. So we're going to add that 81 to both sides. So we're going to add the 81 here. And again, we also have to add 81 to the right-hand side. Okay, negative 75 plus 81 is 6. And on the left-hand side, again, now you've got what should be a perfect square root number. That the factors of 81 that would equal 18 would be this number we had here. So that's going to be x minus 9 squared. So then we'll square root both sides. And again, the square root of x minus 9 squared is just x minus 9. 6 is not any farther that you can break it down, so that would just stay like it is. It's a plus or minus 6. And then one more step, add the 9 to both sides. So x will equal 9 plus the square root of 6, and also 9 minus the square root of 6. Okay, and again, kind of backing up here for a second. This was the part A answer in the homework, and even on the test questions. This would be part A, and this would be part B.